This resolution states support for the development of a new staffing incentive program, and it calls for our intent to pass another ordinance to allow the police department to use its already existing funds in their 2022 budget to pay for it.
Well, that's citywide council member Sarah Nelson there with her take on why hiring bonuses are needed for the Seattle Police Department and how they be paid for from the existing SPD budget. Well, that plan is in discussion this week for the Seattle City Council. They're also discussing how long renters should have to pay off their back rent. And we've got the city attorney talking about dropping a number of backlogged cases, plus an interesting potential change to the way the city council votes on resolutions. All this and so much more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callahan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are my own. And I'm joined by none other than David Croman of the Seattle Times. And David, I wanted to make sure I touched base with you because it feels like you're still coming down after covering all that traffic impact of President Biden's visit last week. How you doing, man? That was kind of a high stress event there.
Well, it was, I don't know that I would describe it as high stress, but it was a little frustrating because WashDOT and SDOT basically couldn't tell me anything because the Secret Service wouldn't let them. So we could see all these roads closing, but we couldn't get anybody to confirm exactly which roads were closed or when, because the Secret Service doesn't let you. So it was fine. It was just we didn't have a lot of concrete information to share with people.
Oh, man. Well, you handled it well, my friend. I'm glad we were able to figure out a few things there as they were coming along. Thank you, as always, for joining me. Thanks to everybody listening out there, especially to our patrons. And it would be much appreciated if more of you who listen could support Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon, especially at the $10 level. That's when you receive your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. You also get special billing as you provide the mug shot of the week. This week, it's Renee sending in a lovely photo of her mug in front of the fireplace. Looks very cozy there. Renee, thank you for that. Everybody else out there, please do support this podcast on Patreon. We're on Converge Media too. Thanks for watching there. The video versions of the podcast air on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, off we go with right here, right now. All right, well, there are a ton of things that are happening on the Seattle Council's many agendas this week. A lot of interesting things cooking here. App-based workers, we talked about this a few weeks ago. They're still working their way through committee, some legislation there. The council also discussing investments into preventing gender-based violence. But one of the top issues I think arising this week, David, is in the Public Safety Committee. This is a resolution from Councilmember Sarah Nelson about hiring bonuses for police officers. So specifically, she wants to lift a proviso the council put in place during the budget process last year, a proviso which said if there are savings on SPD salary and benefits this year, which it appears there will be, we'll get to that in a minute, but if there are savings, the use of that money will be restricted unless authorized by ordinance. So, David, before we talk about bonuses in particular here, I just want to cover why the council put this proviso in place last year. There's been a concern over SPD budgets, especially when it comes to overtime for many, many years.
Yeah, that's right. They were authorized a certain amount of overtime, and they exceeded that, at least in 2020, which is kind of when this conversation got started.
Right.
There was a lot of police spending a lot of time in Capitol Hill with the protests. And so, I think, we talk about salary savings. That's because a lot of officers have left. And so the department is not spending as much on salary. So it's been now a year plus debate around what to do with that money. The city council, out of sort of frustration with they ended up authorizing the extra overtime, but then it initially sort of started that they were going to reclaim some of that money in later years to then spend on alternatives to policing. But things have shifted a lot in the last few years. The conversation, and there was the election. So you have Sarah Nelson on the council now. And this is kind of this is a statement. This is what the police department has been looking for, which is instead of spending the money we didn't spend on salaries on,
alternatives to policing.
That we plow it back into trying to bring those numbers up.
Got it. And just looking at some of these numbers, and I talked with Councilmember Nelson about this on Council Edition on Seattle Channel, if you want to look a little bit further at this, folks. I don't think the SPD is going to be able to hire the 125 officers it planned to this year. a hiring plan that the council fully funded, as Councilmember Herbold will definitely remind you. But last year, the SPD had this plan to hire 121 officers, and we're only able to hire 80. So I guess I'm trying to figure out this point, David. How do you think the rest of the council is going to respond to Councilmember Nelson's plan? Because in looking at this, this really does appear to be a bit of an about face when in terms of where does this surplus money go? This would be a big change potentially for the city council.
Yeah, and the language is really, it draws a very direct line between some crime statistics and increases in crime and and the number of police officers, which that if this were adopted, a lot of the conversation over the last couple of years is,
do more police make us safer? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Having more police decrease the amount of crime, or should that go into alternatives, and would say like education or after school programs, would that kind of do more for decreasing crime? And so this one is a clear kind of connection between the crime rates and the number of police officers. And so if this were adopted, this would be a big change for especially a number of council people. So I don't know what direction they go with this, but even the fact that this is on the table being considered is quite a bit different from at least late 2020 or late summer 2020, when we heard 7 of 9 council people at least express some interest in decreasing the Seattle Police Department's budget.
Right. It's going to be interesting to watch, and I know Councilmember Nelson has been a gadfly at these public safety meetings and pushing back. But I think this is where the argument gets difficult, because making that causal connection, as you're pointing out here, between crime statistics and how many police officers we have, those amounts in terms of where the crime stats have been over the years, those have really changed, even when we have had a high amount of police officers out there. So I don't know, that's going to be a difficult argument to make, I think, in some ways. And I know that it's where the SPD wants to go here, but I think that's going to be a tough argument in the city council.
It is. Yeah, it is. And they're going to be under some pressure from the people that they made a lot of pretty explicit promises to folks around investing in alternatives to policing and growing these programs. And I think for a lot of them, it would be tough to go back on those promises.
Right. This is the test of that.
And you see this all the time in debates around crime, which is it's just nebulous enough that you can kind of make whatever argument you want. If you look nationwide, crime is up everywhere,
all over the place. Yeah.
And regardless of whether or not there was sort of any serious discussion about defunding the police or whatever. So that's one point. But then, another point is the Seattle Police Department is at fairly historically low numbers.
That's right.
So, it's going to be one of those debates where it's not going to have kind of a satisfying, there's not going to be like a conclusion in which we have proven causality in some kind of specific ways. And that's why it makes this whole thing really complicated.
Yeah, it will be, but a great debate to be having at the council level there, and we'll continue to follow that. I did want to talk about another piece of legislation, one that's actually up for a full council vote this week, what's been called a reasonable repayment plan for tenants paying back rent as we make our way out of the COVID emergency. So under this proposal, tenants could pay back rent in monthly installments that do not exceed a third of their monthly rent. So this is for debt incurred during the civil emergency and up to 6 months after the end of the emergency. So, David, I thought there was an interesting twist here. Dan Strauss from District 6 is introducing this plan, and he's not even on the Renters' Rights and Sustainability Committee. What do you make of that piece to start with?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the city council has always been pretty aggressive on sort of renter protections, and I haven't talked to him about this, and so I don't know exactly where his brain is at. But certainly, as the eviction moratorium has ended, and we're looking forward to kind of next steps. Certainly, renter protections and people being able to afford their rent is on top of a lot of people's minds. His district includes Ballard, which is expensive and rapidly changing. So, I don't know where this came from, and and interestingly, it was sort of a lot of time these renter protections come from groups like Working Washington or
Sure.
Washington Can or some kind of
Right.
labor groups that push for it, and then the city council takes it up. This one, I didn't kind of get any sense of that had happened beforehand. That this
No,
was really Councilmember Strauss.
right. Yeah, I think his point on it was he was one of a few people on the council who voted against Councilmember Sawant's plan to extend the eviction moratorium. Remember, it ended at the end of February. There, she wanted to extend it past that date, and he was one of the no votes and said, "I'm going to follow up on this," and so he has.
Yeah.
I just wonder what actually comes of it, though, because the root of all this, and I know we've discussed this a little bit before, these different renter protections that he's talking about have to be accessed through the courts. And in talking with a number of different tenant advocates about this, unfortunately, tenants don't always access these protections, might not even know that the city has a free attorney waiting for them if they indeed go to eviction court here. I'm just trying to figure out what effect in terms of protecting renters is this measure actually going to have?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. And yeah, I think it's well over half of people who are evicted never come to court, despite the
Right.
fact that they have access to a free attorney now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I don't know. I mean, and in some ways, if you can get to court, there are programs available. There's the Home Start program.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly where resources are at right now, but
Sure. Sure.
historically, I used to cover this more closely, but I remember being in eviction court one day and
Mm,
kind of following someone through that court, and it was remarkably easy for that person to um, get connected with resources and stay in their home because there
hmm
was money there. But again, the problem is not, it's less about what happens when you're actually there, but it's getting there in the first place.
Right.
And so, yeah, I don't know if, I don't know how much this repayment plan will be used versus kind of some of the renter protections or, rental relief programs that might be out
Right.
there.
Yeah.
That said, a lot of those programs are pretty taxed lately.
Sure.
And I don't know, like I said, I don't know how deep that well is of rental relief.
Right.
Now.
And it makes me think too that there's not just one solution to the whole concept of protecting renters out there, but it does seem like this court-approved version is something the council is pushing for. So we'll see what happens with this one. But interesting to see Councilmember Strauss getting involved in this conversation. Also interesting to see Councilmember Sawant really not involved in this conversation. It feels like maybe she's busy with all the unionization that's going on around town. I know she's been talking with workers from Starbucks and Amazon. So we'll see what happens with this and what she says in these meetings as they come up this week. But thanks for the breakdown on that, David. I want to stick with the courts here, talk about Ann Davison, our city attorney, ran on a tough on crime platform. So why does she want to drop nearly 2,000 cases off the books? We're going to break it down on Now Hear This. Okay, so Ann Davison, our recently elected city attorney, has made a decision to drop nearly 2,000 misdemeanor cases, theft, property destruction, trespass, and more off the books. This news coming out late last week. So I interviewed Ann Davison when she was a candidate still back in November here. She really wanted to differentiate herself from Nicole Thomas Kennedy, her opponent, who made a promise not to prosecute most misdemeanors. So here's what then candidate Ann Davison said last fall about the importance of protecting crime victims and prosecuting misdemeanors.
The role of our city attorney is to make sure that we are dealing with what our societal limits are to protect them. So the prosecution has to be there.
David, we discussed this a little bit on KUOW last week, but the upshot this week is that Ann Davison is going to be talking about how she's dealing with this backlog of cases at the City Council's Public Safety Committee meeting on Tuesday. So even after dropping 2,000 cases, there's still roughly 3,000 to try to get off the books in terms of a backlog. She's going to ask the council for more money to help do that. I just wanted to try to figure out, how do you think the council is going to react to that budget request?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think again, if this was maybe 2 years ago, I would say very poorly.
Yes, right,
um, because that would, that would represent, and not only an expansion of the criminal justice system, but in an expansion of prosecuting misdemeanors, which
right,
is the lowest level and kind of the most easily tied to folks who probably need a lot of other supports,
right.
be it mental health resources or
Addiction
substance
resources,
use,
sure,
um,
yeah.
things like that. And so, this is exactly the sort of category that this council in the past has been really hesitant to crack down on. And things, the conversation has shifted a bit. We have one, as we just talked about, Sarah Nelson has joined the council, which makes a little bit of a difference, but it's not like this council is suddenly some super tough on crime city council. And so, asking for more criminal prosecutors, I don't know. I mean, I think that's going to be a little bit of a tough lift with this council.
Yeah. You have a former assistant city attorney in Andrew Lewis, who's not all that big of a fan of prosecuting misdemeanors, at least to the level where Ann Davison is talking about. So that's a piece of this puzzle too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He's been a big supporter of LEAD and
other alternatives.
Other alternatives. The thing about this I'll be curious to see. I mean, there's, as we talked about on KUW, there's always a gap between what people say on the council, on the campaign trail, and what the reality is. And anyone who had been paying attention to this could have told you that the reality of the city attorney's office and Seattle Municipal Court is that it was terribly backlogged, and it was going to require a certain amount of triaging to actually work through the cases and decide which ones you prioritize and which ones you don't, because especially with the coronavirus, the whole system is facing these pretty enormous backlogs. And then it's you start to come up, I don't know about technically, but you sort of come up with due process questions both for the victims or the accused, the alleged victims and the accused, because suddenly the people who are accused of committing a misdemeanor are waiting 2 years for a trial and
some sort of adjudication, right?
People on the other end of it are kind of sitting there waiting for a long time. And so and then meanwhile, these cases get colder and colder as you get further and further away from the actual incident. And so it was always going to be the case, I think, if you do the math, that there was just no way that office could work through 5,000 cases. The question, though, is this kind of a one-time thing that she's doing to clear the books, and then she's going to slam her fist down from here on out?
Sure, right.
Or is this just kind of the reality of this office, that there's never going to be any way that you can actually prosecute every single misdemeanor that comes through your office? And Pete Holmes would tell you it's the latter. That
yes, right.
The office, by its own nature, requires prioritization. But Ann Davison ran explicitly against that kind of mindset, and so if she wants to hold her campaign promise, she's probably going to have to figure out a way to actually address all of these.
Yeah, and I mean, this whole triage idea, which is kind of what we're talking about here with Ann Davison, believe it or not, folks, this is something that Pete Holmes was talking about before he was elected out of office. And I just try to imagine if he had said, I'm going to get rid of these 2,000 cases as a backlog, what the public reaction would have been there. But I did want to touch on one more piece of this. I think it's an interesting cross-section. You have people like Sarah Nelson who want to get tough on crime for sure. But then at the same time, she's hearing from a lot of business owners who are saying, okay, tough on crime, there's got to work through the system or whatever else, the court system. We need restitution now. We need some help for that broken window now. And waiting for the justice system to work through it doesn't necessarily help those business owners. I wonder where those two issues intersect, David. I think that could be an interesting piece of this too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that will be interesting. And I mean, does prosecuting, we hear a lot about frequent offenders, and the kind of the thing that underlies that is the fact that a lot of these people are being arrested a lot and are being taken to jail, and a lot of their cases are being prosecuted. But when it comes down to it, these are misdemeanors. The maximum sentence on these is 364 days. And so the question of cycling through, I mean, you can get tough on crime to a certain extent with the city attorney's office, but does it mean that these people, a lot of these people are gonna, without other supports and other systems, we've seen the evidence of it, will return back to kind of what they were doing before, and then probably get arrested again and probably get let out again, and so
right.
The real
solve
question,
the problem.
Right. The real question that will be interesting, I mean, even if she could prosecute 5,000 misdemeanor cases, does it maybe there's a temporary reprieve, but does it make any difference in the long run?
These are all tough questions. They're
Yeah.
going to be talked about in the city council this week. So, David, thank you for bringing that up. There's another interesting piece that's happening for the council this week, coming up in the governance committee on Thursday. This is on when council members vote and when they don't. So, let's look at this, folks. So, December of last year, the council amended the council rules to allow abstentions on resolutions that, with the sole discretion of the council president, are not materially related to city government. Very interesting thing here. So the council passes resolutions all the time, renaming city streets after Lenny Wilkins or transferring excess property, things like this. But what about those other resolutions that always get the headlines, like expressing support for the U.S. collaborating with Cuba in the fight against COVID-19 or protesting farming bills in India? These are actual resolutions voted on by the council over the past year or so. So this new legislation has been proposed by council member Alex Peterson, who's a big fan of casting that abstain vote, I should point out. So he says of the 245 resolutions the council has considered since 2019, council members could have abstained from 19% of them based on this new proposal here. David, what do you make of what Councilmember Peterson is trying to do here?
Yeah, I mean, you alluded to this being something that's in the headlines a lot, and every time something like this comes up, the even if it doesn't take a lot of time, and I've always been a little bit skeptical that council members are devoting that much significant time towards some of these resolutions. But whenever they do come up, what follows is the question of, well, why are you focusing on this when we've got this homelessness crisis or all these other big issues? And so
Sure.
I think probably what the abstention, allowing someone like Councilmember Peterson to abstain from some of these non-city resolutions, I mean, I think it's kind of a signal, in some ways, sort of a protest against their existence at all. That he might theoretically agree with it, but there's some disagreement around whether or not the city council should be taking these up at all.
Right.
And then also by having the right to abstain, his office those offices don't have to spend any time kind of researching the issue if they don't want to. They can just abstain and kind of move on to other things. So
no, I think of this too because you mentioned taking the time on it, and I remember it was Councilmember Sawant who brought up this farming bill in India or whatever else, and it turned into a hours-long discussion for the city council at the end of last year. And this is one of these things where I think a lot of people on the council were getting very frustrated by this. Granted, it's an important issue, certainly to the people of India, but taking 2 hours of city time to discuss something like that, it turns into a bit of an issue for anybody following city government. But I do notice this in terms of looking through the list of different measures that council members could have abstained from if this law was in place. A lot of these things are coming from Councilmember Sawant's office, and I think there's at least a partial pointed at her office with some of these things. And I know it's something that Council President Juarez gets upset about too, and really wants to move things along. But it feels like there's a lot of fingers that are pointing potentially at Councilmember Sawant on this one.
Yeah, I think that's probably true because as you mentioned, a lot of these resolutions about kind of larger worldly issues have come from her.
Yeah. I wonder what happens with the introduction of more resolutions in the future here. What's next with this? But an interesting piece of governance going on right now for the Seattle City Council. So we'll track that down as it plays out later on this week. All right. So up next, are you still wearing a mask on the bus downtown or on an airplane? Well, a lot of agencies are saying you don't need one. So what's happening? David's got some more on Transportation Talk. All right, David, I want you to break this down for us if you can. So many transit agencies around our area are now dropping mask mandates. This all centers around a federal judge last week striking down the CDC's mask mandate on planes and mass transit. They said the CDC was overstepping its bounds here. So what's happening here locally?
Locally, most transit agencies, and maybe all, I haven't seen any exceptions, have followed the path set by that Florida judge. They are making masking no longer a requirement. I don't know that there are any agencies that are still requiring it. I haven't found any yet.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, I think in some ways it's an acknowledgement, with the Transit Security Administration saying they're no longer going to enforce. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of enforcement happening before, but once it becomes explicit that enforcement is basically off the table, and clearly a lot of other a lot of the transit agencies in the region wanted to drop this requirement. I think
Sure.
it became a situation where even those like maybe King County Metro, who initially seemed inclined to keep the requirement, I think it became this thing where it was too patchwork. You if you're on a bus and on a King County Metro bus and then transfer to Pierce Transit bus, or
take
something
off
like
the
that.
mask then, right? Yeah.
It was, and so it just became clear that this is, the toothpaste is out of the tube, and they all jointly came together and said, all right, we're not requiring this anymore.
Yeah, but you brought up a great point, I thought, on KOW last week, which was about this issue and what it means for the future of the CDC. Because if you want to try to respect that organization and its ability to put out these different public health directives here, the Justice Department is actually appealing this to try to make sure that this piece of it is at least intact. Let's talk about what's at stake here with this court case, because politically, this is something that's pretty risky for the Justice Department here, and very risky potentially for the CDC.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I'm a little skeptical that the Biden administration is really fighting to put these mask requirements.
Right. It's less about that.
Because they were going to expire May 3rd anyway.
Yeah.
The popularity of these has really, in some ways has gone down. And so, but what this ruling would possibly do is create this precedent of really limiting the CDC's ability to regulate this stuff. The judge seemed to have kind of lopped off a lot of basically, there's a list of things that the CDC is allowed to regulate, and then there's kind of an et cetera.
Yes, right.
The mask mandate was living under that et cetera, and this judge seems to have kind of lopped that off, and so that would make a big difference going into the future. And so then it becomes this kind of legal gamesmanship question is, maybe the Justice Department, I think the ideal thing for the Justice Department would be to appeal it once to to the next highest level, win, and then for it to stay there, because then the last federal decision is no longer the one that they don't like, that limits the CDC's regulatory ability.
Yes.
And if it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, we know that this is a more conservative Supreme Court, and then the Justice Department kind of risks really setting into stone limits.
Right.
Authority.
This is it's a very interesting policy debate going on a national level here. So thank you for your input on that, David. As we wrap up the show, a tough question for you, sir. The King County Administration Building has been shuttered. Your colleague David Gutton was writing about this last week. So there's the building, folks, on 4th and 5th Avenues between James and Jefferson Streets. And the question is this, David: is this a piece of architectural triumph or the ugliest building in Seattle history? What do you got?
I find it pretty ugly. It's in that world of things where you do notice it, and so, if you're the kind of person who thinks that if art is meant to invoke feelings, and this building clearly invokes feelings, and so if you're in that camp, that maybe you like it. I don't think all feelings are good, and in this case, I think it's a pretty ugly building, and I'm not sad to see it go.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with that one. That's going to be an architectural battle on the streets of Seattle playing out there. So we'll see how that pans out. Well, thank you, David, as always, for talking with me. And thanks, everybody out there, for listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. It's great to have you here once again, and we very much thank you for joining us here. This podcast is available on all of the major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please do support the show on Patreon. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.